pleasure of having Dr. Roger Azevedo here. He comes from State. He got his doctorate degree from McGill University in 1998. From there, he moved to the University of Maryland. We share that in common as well. And he was hired 3 years ago, 2 years ago? 2 years ago as a cluster hire at North Carolina State, where they're looking to, it was called the Digital Transformation of Education. And so Roger and I have had the pleasure of having many discussions over the past couple of months because we've submitted an NSF grant where we're going to try to incorporate some of his technology into our anatomy and physiology labs. So without further ado, please, Roger.
Thank you so much, Candice. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And guess we'll have to wait a couple more months to figure out if NSF likes our proposal. So today I kind of want to give you kind of a glimpse of what we've been doing for the last 20 years, but focus specifically on MetaTutor, which is also what we have focused on for our NSF grant that's currently under review. And MetaTutor is an environment to actually train and help students regulate their cognitive, metacognitive, affective, and motivation. So you're going to hear this acronym that we use called CAM. That's what it stands for. So we're really interested in figuring out how students, whether it's a middle school kid learning STEM, high school kid, community college, medical student, surgeon, whatever it may be, how do they use these cognitive, metacognitive, affective, motivational processes when they're learning about complex topics? So a lot of this stuff, for example, will be on the circulatory system, which was what we've done a lot for the last several decades. So, but I also live in an interdisciplinary world, because I've been trained as a psychologist, but I also play different hats. I can be the educational researcher, I'm a cognitive psychologist, I'm a cognitive scientist by training also, but I'm not a STEM expert, and I'm not a computer scientist, and I'm not an AI researcher. So a lot of our work involves the interdisciplinary fusion of different methods and expertise. And we've been very fortunate over the last 15 years to be heavily funded by NSF and NIH and IS. And when I was at McGill as a researcher before being pulled down here, a lot of other Canadian federal funding agencies have supported this research. So here's, can we dim the lights? Is that okay? It's gonna be a little bit better. Thank you. So here's a typical student. Can we reverse it real quick? Oh, is that here? Nope. Nope. Of course, it's going to be the last one. Is that better? So here's a typical student. This happens to be in the laboratory, okay, but this is a student much like yours. A student is learning about the circulatory system. In fact, she's using an older version of MetaTutor, which is not adaptive, it had no AI in it, okay? And so as a psychologist, we make a lot of inferences, right? Because we need to see observable behavior. So it's got to be verbal, nonverbal, gestural, etc. And then we look at that data and we try to make inferences about how students are monitoring and regulating these complex processes. So here's an example. So I'm just going to play a little bit and to get your, see this actually work. And this is all she does for 50 minutes. Okay, so here I'm a psychologist, we're collecting video data, we collect log file data, we know where she is. And so the big question for us is, well, is this, sorry?
Would she normally read this aloud, or is she just doing this for?
She's doing a think aloud protocol, which we use in cognitive science, where we basically get the expert or the novice to amplify their sub-vocalization. So, okay, and if it's done properly, so it doesn't interfere with their normal reading. And then what we do is we take that language, we parse it into the different strategies, etc. But she just keeps doing this. All she's doing is reading. Okay, so the question becomes, well, is she self-regulating while she's learning about the circulatory system? And then what's the evidence? Because what we see a lot in the literature, whether it's science education, etc., people have to talk about, my students ain't engaged. And as a psychologist, the first thing I ask is, well, how do you know? What does engagement mean, right? That they have pupil dilation? I mean, maybe took amphetamine, I don't know. Okay. Or is it the number of newtons, exactly, or the shaking, or number of newtons they're applying to the table as they're engaged, okay? Or people talk about, well, my student's motivated. Well, how do we know it's motivated? He or she is motivated. So we need to find evidence, and that's kind of what we question. So we look for multiple ways of measuring these complex constructs. So in terms of our research, not to go into it, basically what we do is we try to examine these CAM processes, that's what we're interested in, whether they're self-generated by the student, okay, or they're externally regulated by an agent, so we have intelligent virtual humans that now replace humans, okay, or a human tutor, okay. We try to figure out what is the dynamics. We also do basic and applied psychological research, so we either work in the lab or a real-world context. So for example, last week we just completed a 8-day study in an 8th grade hydrosphere unit, which was like being at the OK Corral. Okay. Then the big thing I want to share with you is this types of data. We need to converge different types of data because the different types of data give us different types of evidence as to what the student is doing and learning. So we will call it multi-channel data. So we collect eye tracking data. We figure out if the student is putting the text and the diagram, for example, together. What are those processes? Log file data at the millisecond level. We know exactly what they did, what they clicked on, which hyperlink, which diagram they're looking at, which piece of text. Facial expressions. We also look at emotions. One way to look at human emotions is to actually do a full-on facial expression. So you want to see if the student's confused, because we have action units, which are micro expressions. And so the student's confused, as a psychologist, I want to know what is the antecedent, why are they confused, because they weren't confused before. So it could be that the confusion is the complexity of the diagram. They've never seen this complex diagram, for example, of the heart, okay? So we want to track it, and we want to figure out that, well, then we need to do something about it, because what would you do as a STEM faculty, right? So we want to do that with the environment. And physiological sensors, okay? So we may see a spike in arousal. What led to that spike in arousal? So these are some of the multi-channel data. I'll show you some of the sample. And what we're trying to figure out is, how did these processes unfold over time? And this is the complexity that we are faced with, that we are very impoverished in terms of educational psychology and models of learning and instruction, okay? Because a student who demonstrates that they don't have the right learning strategy, they don't know how to monitor whether they're understanding what they're reading, okay? And they show prolonged negative emotions, like they keep getting frustrated and confused, however you measure it. And guess what? Just like we experienced last week, especially with the younger kids, they don't care about the task. I don't care about water quality, okay? So I don't want to learn about nitrates and phosphates, and, you know? And so these are problems that if we don't do something about them, then how are we going to get them engaged in terms of learning style? So we need to collect these data, and then, but we need to do it by analyzing how they temporally unfold in real time. Okay? Most of the studies that are done are, we give the kid a pre-test, right? How much they learn about the circulatory system. They use some kind of online environment or MOOC, and then we give them a post-test. Oh, then we make inferences about learning. Well, this deals with what happens in between. If a student, for example, in a typical study, has a low pre-test score on the circulatory system, and then has a high pre-test score, okay, is that person different than the student who came in with a very low pre-test score and ended up with the same score? Okay, what are the differences both qualitatively and quantitatively? And that's what we try to do. And of course, we're also in the business of using not only statistical methods, but also data mining and machine learning. And this is where we need our colleagues from computer science and AI. And we are in the business also developing these intelligent learning environments. By intelligence, what we mean is that they have enough artificial intelligence in them to be able to detect and provide students with adaptive, personalized instruction in real time, okay? So that's a little bit of what we do. And being a cluster hire, so there are 5 of us, 2 in computer science, I'm the 1 in psychology and 2 in education at NC State. As I mentioned, I live amongst other folks, right? So in psychology, I'm in human factors and applied cognition. We deal with folks in STEM education, whether it be teacher training. We have colleagues in computer science and engineering and robotics. So affective computing is a really high, very topical issue right now. Human-computer interaction, okay? So if your interface is not developed properly, the kid's gonna be turned off, okay? And then we sometimes forget those folks. These are the folks who make our interfaces look pretty, okay? These are the design artists, okay? And of course, amongst you, of course, you guys straddle several of these, you're the domain experts, right? When we work in oncologists, well, I'm not an oncologist, but we do stuff in cancer, okay? So depending on the project, we will have a certain number of overlapping expertise, okay? And these are some of the issues that we try to tackle, okay? So when we talk about scaffolding, everybody likes to talk about scaffolding. And the question is, again, what is scaffolding, okay? Are we going back to the old Vygotsky approach of scaffolding? Because at some point we need to fade away all support. But the question is, do we need to fade away? Okay, when do we fade? How do we fade? Okay, these questions we have difficulties answering because we don't know, really. Okay, so if we don't know, how are we going to design intelligent systems to be able to emulate or embody these processes? Okay? Or measuring these real-time deployment of these processes, and we'll show you some of that data. Okay, so these are some of the key issues that we're dealing with. Okay, and these are the folks that we work with. And on the top is we need to have a science of learning with technology. A lot of the literature, and I did my master's in that tech, and that's one of the things that turned me away from educational technology, because there's this very behavioristic approach to human learning, right? Oh, okay, we don't care about processes, we just pre-test and post-test. No, we need to understand the mechanisms by which students reason, problem solve, okay, develop conceptual understanding. So this is kind of the world that we live in. These are some, before I get into Meditude, these are some of the environments that over the years that we've developed. So when I was in McGill, we actually developed an intelligent tutoring system to teach mammography, okay, to medical, to radiology residents. And we continued that work with my postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. Here's another one where we did it for the SICU nurses. Okay, so we had a male, and if you squint, that's me getting extra money to fund my graduate assistantship by pretending to be the person in this motor vehicle accident with full casualty makeup on. Okay, so you come in, you got a broken orbital bone, you have distended abdomen, etc. Be basically a mess. So the question is, what is the nurse going to do in terms of doing a systemic evaluation of this patient before he or she dies? Okay, we've also worked with University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. This NIH project just finished. We were trying to slow down the pathologists because they're getting lawsuits and they're too quickly in terms of diagnosing, in terms of histology. So we actually embedded metacognitive prompts to slow down the diagnostic reasoning process and increase their accuracy. Okay. We've done stuff with EPA data with kids. This is just a simulation to teach them about causation, for example, in terms of nitrates and phosphates, different land uses. And this is one that we are working on now, which is called SimSelf, and it has artificial or intelligent virtual humans. This is the one we just finished last week, the Hydrosphere unit. The one I'm going to talk about is Meditutor, and we'll see that in a little bit. It happens to be in the circulatory system. We also have an agent. The agent plays the role basically of a mentor or the role of an instructor who's going to provide the external regulation. In other words, it is monitoring what the student is doing, and then at some point in time, based on what the student does or does not do, okay, so for example, if the student selects that there and tells the system, now I want to learn about systemic circulation, all of a sudden, they click on a hyperlink of content related to circulatory system in non-humans. So we know that that particular page and diagram is not related to your current goal, but we don't the agent does not intervene immediately. It waits for the student to engage that metacognitive process to realize that, hey, you know what? This is my goal, this is my content, it's not related. So behaviorally, we should see the student click somewhere else to find content that's related. If the student doesn't and exceeds a particular threshold, this is when the agent, in a very gentle way, okay, basically prompt, do you think this content is related to your sub-goal? Just to trigger that metacognitive process. And depending whether the student says yes or no, then it engages in a dialogue. If the student who still thinks that that content is related, then you need to provide a justification, and you engage in the dialogue with the system. This is one that we also did. We like to continue to work here for oncology. So we took a light version of Meditutor and we created one called Virtual Self. And this is, we worked with the Breast Disease Center at McGill University, one of the teaching hospitals, and it was to teach women who've just been diagnosed with stage 1 and stage 2 cancer, to teach them about the spread of breast cancer and what is breast cancer. In terms of self-regulation, I'm not going to get into the whole theory, but just to say that basically, there is agency, right? We as learners, any learner, any human, we have agency, so we can exert control, right, over what we do, how we learn, how we perform, and that's what we're interested in, okay? And from a metacognitive monitoring, so in other words, a little homunculus inside of us, right, as you're doing any kind of work, whether you're writing an email or learning about the circulatory system or the digestive system, okay, you are always should be monitoring what you are doing, right? Am I spending enough time on this content? Should I put more effort because I'm running out of time? Because now I'm monitoring my progress towards goals, etc. And then if I am doing that and doing it accurately, then how do I modify my behavior? And that's what we're interested in doing. We're also interested in things like, for example, when a student creates an inference, right, from your perspective, well, I'm not the expert in the area in terms of the content area. So we want to know if a student, for example, after reading a certain amount of content is making the correct inference, right, or an incorrect inference. This is where we need a subject matter expert to tell us that, because I can't do that, okay? However, I can determine whether the student is accurately monitoring and judging how much they understand, okay, versus that they don't understand. And this is what's interesting from an adaptive perspective as a human, is that if a student somehow verbally, non-verbally indicates that they don't understand something, then adaptively, from a human perspective, we would expect them to use a strategy, right? So if I just say, I don't understand, I've been reading this, looking at this diagram of the valves and the atria and the ventricles, I still don't understand about how blood flows through all these chambers, okay? Then if the student expresses that either verbally or non-verbally, then we expect the student to be using a learning strategy that addresses that, right? So what would be a learning strategy that would address the fact that I just realized I don't understand how this is? What would be some strategies?
Go back and reread it.
Go back and reread, so we would expect rereading, right? Maybe try drawing it, okay, uncovering it, right? So we would expect these students to do the same things online in terms of our systems. As opposed to engaging in maladaptive behavior, is that just indicate they don't understand, yet they're plowing through the content as we see. Right? Yeah, go faster, 500 miles an hour. I'm sure it's really going to increase your comprehension. So this is where we have these issues with learning is, well, if the student does that, the maladaptive, when do we stop the student, right? We don't know. Is there a threshold? Is there a sweet spot? Right? And if you stop the student, are you actually being very abrupt, which some of our agents tend to be, and what does that do, right? In terms of, well, I shouldn't say the word kill, but maybe killing their motivation, their intrinsic motivation, right? Maybe they need to read a little bit more because they're trying to figure out if it's still relevant, but we don't know. And that threshold could be different for each individual student, okay? So this adds to the complexity.